Everybody. We are taking up the talk with the title The First and Last Freedom. And I hope all of you are able to see the screen which I am sharing, which is the first slide of the PowerPoint presentation related to this particular talk. Is it okay? Are everybody hope are able to see it?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
we are able to see.
Okay, thank you. Now J. Krishnamurti starts his talk by this sentence. He says, to communicate with one another, even if we know each other very well, is extremely difficult. And I have added the words in the bracket in the second paragraph. Instantaneous understanding comes when you and I, meet on the same level at the same time with the same intensity. This happens only when there is real affection between people. That is real communion. This has been what Krishnaji has been emphasizing throughout his talks. He has always been telling us that unless the speaker and the listener meet at the same level, at the same time, with the same intensity, communication will not happen. That means you and I are supposed to be with the same seriousness and the same level of thought process at the same time. Unless this happens, it is not possible to communicate. And he says this is possible only when there is real affection between people. Quite often Krishnaji used to start his talks by saying, let us meet like two friends, very much concerned about what we are talking. It's not something which is a casual talk or a communication which is just for whiling away time and discussing what we find in the newspapers and all. It's not that kind of communication or the subject which we are dealing with here. We are really concerned with ourselves and the world around us, both. Because Krishnaji used to always insist that you are the world and you are not two different entities. You are in close relationship with each other, and the relationship is so close that there is no distinction between you and the world around you. So that was the idea with which he used to always communicate. And unless we have the same commitment to discover and examine what we are looking into, it becomes difficult because one will be left behind and somebody will be moving ahead. So that he never wanted to happen, and he would always, even sometimes in between talks, he would stop and say, are we together? Are we together? So that was his concern, so that we move together and then come to the same understanding. And this understanding, according to Krishnaji, happens instantaneously. It's not that you take a lot of time to understand or come to it. If you have that real affection and that concern and the seriousness for the subject and for also the person with whom you are communicating, the understanding would happen instantaneously. So here he goes on to emphasize that he is only using very ordinary English terms and no technical or scientific terms at all in the discussion which he is going to have. Because he very clearly says that I have not read any books on psychology or any religious books, fortunately. This is fortunately, I have never read any of these things. So what I would like to communicate or convey is by very simple words which we use in our daily life, but they have a deeper significance. They have a deeper significance. That deeper significance is what we have to relate ourselves to. And earlier we have seen that in one of his talks he said the words have to be used as a bridge to cross over, not to hold on and hang on to the words and then sit on the bridge itself. So we are trying to go to a deeper level of understanding. And unfortunately, words are the only means of communication available, and therefore we are using them because we have no other choice. And the whole purpose is that we should be in a receptive state of mind. Then only things can be understood easily. But then here in the, if you are able to see the second slide, he says that there is an art of listening. To be able really to listen, one should abandon or put aside all prejudices, pre-formulations, and daily activities. This is what is required. If not fully, at least temporarily, while we are actually listening to somebody, we should not allow our mind to be crowded with our own biases, prejudices, predilections, opinions, impressions, and pre-formulations, as he calls. We should at least temporarily keep these things aside so that we are able to listen. Don't justify, don't judge, don't condemn, don't accept, don't reject. Don't do any of these things. Just let us listen to what the other person is saying. As he says, this normally what happens is that we always listen through a screen of resistance. That's why he says, but unfortunately, most of us listen through a screen of resistance. Therefore, we listen really to our own noise. We don't listen to the other person. In fact, we only listen to our own noise in the mind, and we miss most of the significance of what the speaker is saying. So this screen of resistance, this has to be dropped. This has to be removed. This has to be actually shattered. Otherwise, what happens is there is always the I, the me, and all my experiences, knowledge, and memory will come to the fore, and then create this barrier. Create this barrier of resistance, and you will not be able to listen to anything. So that's why he says there is no perception when there is resistance. There's absolutely no perception. And he goes on to say that please do not resist. You may be right and I may be wrong. He accepts the fact that you may be right and I may be wrong, but please allow the speaker to say what he wants to say. You can judge him later, you can come to your own conclusions later, but when you are actually listening, if you are allowing the speaker to say something, then what happens is we will be able to go together and find out what is the truth. After all, that is the objective. The objective is not accepting or rejecting each other's opinion. I accept your opinion, or you accept my opinion, or we come to some middle level, meet midway, and then come to some compromise or conditioned acceptance. No, that's not the idea. The whole idea is that we are supposed to be on a journey to discover truth. And truth is neither yours nor mine. Truth is truth. And it can't be different for different people and different conditions or things like that. So the whole purpose is to discover the truth. If you keep that in mind, you will be able to drop this resistance, and keep aside all our prejudices and biases and opinions. Therefore, that's why he says truth cannot be given to you by somebody. You have to discover, and to discover that there must be a state of mind in which there is direct perception. Actually, we are going on a journey, on an adventure of self-discovery and discovering the truth for oneself. However great the other person may be, however high the other person may be situated as compared to oneself, he will not be in a position to communicate the truth to you. It can't be actually given by somebody like mundane knowledge. Somebody can teach you how to drive. Somebody can teach you how to read or write. But this is not the case here. The case is here is of a journey of self-discovery, and actually we are moving inward. In that process, we have come together because we are all serious about the matter. And we are moving together. This together does not necessarily mean that it's an outward movement. This is a togetherness in an inward movement where we are able to discover. And that requires a state of mind where there is direct perception. That is why he says there is no perception when there is resistance, a safeguard, a protection, your own ideas, your own opinions. You create a wall around yourself. That is not possible, and that resistance will only allow more and more noise in your own mind to come out rather than your ability to really listen to somebody. Then he goes on to say, understanding comes through being aware of what is. This is a very important point, and wherever there are significant points, I have put them in dark blue, as you can see, and mostly in italics also. That's only to emphasize things. So the whole process of understanding is to become aware of what is. What is as you are, as it is, as things stand. Whether it is about yourself or whether it is about the environment, whatever you are examining, whatever you are trying to observe and become aware of, it is something which should be live and present here and now, and that is what you are seeing. Krishna often used to give. Suppose I see that I am filled with a certain emotion. That emotion is a reality to me. If I am angry, if I am frustrated, if I am greedy, if I am violent, we should be in a position to examine that, to become aware of that, because that is the truth. That is what is the truth. So unless you are able to see the what is, unfortunately the mind in its own mechanism has developed its own mechanism for self-protection, for justification, for condemnation and all kinds of things, and therefore it is not willing to see things as they are or to see the what is. Seeing the what is, sometimes what happens is it becomes very difficult because we are unable to accept it. Accepting the what is a big problem for the mind, and therefore it doesn't want to accept it, and because it cannot accept, it doesn't want to see also. See, if I see that I have greed in me, or if I am angry, and that happens to be the reality, or that happens to be my normal state of being, is a kind of general frustration prevailing in the mind. Now, the first thing one would do is one would like to put it on somebody. Say, I am not really frustrated, sir, but the world around me is causing this, and therefore I am frustrated. It's not me that is frustrated. It is the circumstances and the situations which are causing me to be frustrated. So that is the justification it would bring into picture immediately. So what is happening is you are missing the point. You're not able to, one is not able to see what is. I am not able to see that I am frustrated. I am in a state of anger. I am in a state of being where violence seems to be the predominant factor. So understanding comes through only when one is aware of what is. And a very interesting statement, the next one, to acknowledge, to be aware of what one is already the beginning of wisdom, the beginning of understanding, which releases you from time. This is a very serious statement and very profound and needs lot of contemplation and going into oneself to understand what exactly is meaning, what exactly is trying to convey. To acknowledge, to be aware of what one is already the beginning of wisdom. See, wisdom is a kind of illumination and a very powerful source of illumination, because it will illumine all the dark corners of the mind, all the hidden corners, all the stored, where you have pushed things into the background. All that becomes apparent and visible in the light of this wisdom. Wisdom is that illumination. And therefore, he says, once you become aware of what is, that is the beginning of wisdom. That means you have moved into the area of the illumination, which is coming from that source, which he is calling it as wisdom. See, the title of the talk itself is The First and Last Freedom. You have to be free right at the beginning. One can't say that I will progressively become free. I will progressively become free of my bondage. That's not the idea at all. You have to be free at the beginning. And that freedom comes through being aware of what is. And therefore he says, it's already the beginning of wisdom and the beginning of understanding, which releases you from time. This is a very, very important aspect, being released from time. Because the mind operates in a framework where it thinks of yesterday and tomorrow more than the present. So anything that is inconvenient, which is popping up from the past, we simply avoid it or reject it and do not allow it to come into the fore. And anything that is inconvenient to you, if at all we have to confront it, we take it as though that, okay, I am angry. Tomorrow I will not be angry. Or I will practice not to be angry. Or I will practice not to be violent or not to be greedy. Now, the moment you have postponed it to tomorrow, the seriousness is lost. Would you postpone something which is very serious to you? Suppose you have a terrible pain anywhere in the body. Would you look at it as a concept and say, okay, this pain is there today, I can't do anything about it, let me think of it tomorrow? You won't do that. You would be seriously concerned in this moment. At this moment, I want to get rid of the pain. I don't want to suffer the consequences of the pain that is there in my body. So I need to take immediate action. So that action is in the now. That means you are not concerned about yesterday nor tomorrow when you are serious about something. It becomes important now and here. That is what he means, that it releases you from time. To bring in the quality of time not in the chronological sense, but as the medium, as the psychological process, the process of the mind is destructive and creates confusion. This is what happens. You are bringing a psychological process into and putting it together with time. We have earlier seen that he talks about the chronological time according to the clock or the watch. That is something which is common for all our experience, and he's not talking about that time. He's talking about the psychological time which the mind lives in, because the mind can project a future, the mind can imagine things, the mind can simply postpone things, the mind can think in terms of a process which is involved in time. That means I will take up this issue of anger or greed or envy or jealousy or even spirituality or God or whatever it is progressively. Slowly let me understand, and progressively I will move towards in that direction. That is a great fallacy. That is a great fallacy which the mind doesn't see. And it is not capable of seeing because it doesn't want to see. It is unable to do anything with it in the present, and therefore it keeps on postponing things. So you see the problem. This process, he says, is destructive and creates confusion. Why we are not out of any of this confusion and misery is because we have involved ourselves in this psychological process. The seriousness is totally lost, and therefore it is destructive. It is destructive because it is not allowing you to actually move. You're only trying to move psychologically and thinking that tomorrow I'll do this, day after tomorrow I'll do that, day after that I'll do that. But let us look at a simple fact. Let us look at a very simple fact. Can anybody be in this world sure of being alive tomorrow? Can anybody give a guarantee, or can somebody say with 100% guarantee that I'm going to wake up alive tomorrow morning? It is something which is not possible at all. We don't know. There's an unknown factor in this chronological time also. What I call is as tomorrow, both from the chronological or the psychological aspect of it, we are not sure of the next moment. So I have actually seen a case. See, a friend of mine, long back, almost I think it is more than a quarter century, we were working together in the bank. And we came to know about the incident later when his family members told us that he was getting ready to go to the office. He was all dressed up with all his lunch packed and his bag and everything was ready. He actually just bent down to tie his shoelaces, and he fell forward and died. He simply fell forward and died. Now look at the situation. What could be the trauma on to the wife and the children and the family when something like this happens? But more importantly, he himself never thought that just by bending to tie his laces would be the last moment of his life and he would fall forward on his face and die. Not that this happens every day to people, but what can happen to somebody can happen to anybody else also, because the law of probability operates that way in the whole universe. Nobody is exempt from it. Neither we wish or nor we prepare ourselves for it, but this is a reality, this is a fact. And when this is the situation, if we are able to confront that, then automatically the seriousness will come to us. And that is the secret behind what Krishnaji used to say, that life, love and death are all one and the same. They are in the same stream. It is the same progression. Whether you call it as life or love or death, it is the same progression. They are not three different things. Now somebody may start feeling and thinking that how can life and death be one and the same? Because it's a continuity. Death of the physical body appears to be a great event that happens, and you have lost, one has lost the body. through which one has been functioning for several decades. So you see the problem now. So the psychological process to bring in that quality of time as the medium, as a psychological process, the process of the mind is destructive and creates confusion. It only creates confusion because it wants more and more clarity, more and more of information, more and more of somebody telling me something, instead of actually understanding the fact. Instead of actually understanding the fact, we move in that direction. So this has to be understood very clearly. The very title, when he says that this is the first and the last freedom, he means by that this is what happens. The beginning is also the end. The beginning of wisdom and the beginning of understanding is also the ending of it, because we are not talking in the framework of time and space. We're not talking in that dimension at all. And therefore, it is the freedom to inquire should be at the beginning. And that freedom comes, as he says, when you keep aside all your prejudices, all your biases, all your opinions and ideas about life and things. That is the freedom which we need to bring to understand anything. And only then you will be able to see with that total clarity what is. Coming to the next slide. So we can have understanding of what is when we recognize it without condemnation, without justification, without identification. This third aspect of without identification is important. The identification process is that process of name and form. Name and form. Everything what the mind conceives, what the mind can grasp, it needs to have a name and a form, or at least one of the two. If not a form, it wants a name. If not a name, it wants a form. And most of the time it wants both, then only it's able to understand things. So you have to come to that state where you are not identifying it with anything. You're neither accepting nor rejecting, neither condemning nor justifying. You are actually having no identification of the what is also. The what is a reality. So he says you can recognize it without condemnation, when you can recognize it without condemnation, without justification, without identification. To know that one is in a certain condition, in a certain state, is already a process of liberation. You see the beauty of it? Are you able to see the beauty of that statement? That you are in a certain state of consciousness where none of these things are operating. Your opinions, your ideas, your justifications, your condemnations, your identification, your classification, and all these things, when they are not there, you are in a state, and it is already a process of liberation. You have initiated a process which is totally in a different dimension as compared to the usual processes with which the mind is familiar with. The mind is familiar with certain processes which are in the framework of time, in the framework of space. When these two are not operating, that state of your mind or your consciousness, it has initiated a process in a totally different dimension, which he calls it as liberation. And again, I have put it in italics and blue, the statement. It takes an extraordinarily astute mind, an extraordinarily pliable heart to be aware of and to follow what is. The mind has to be in an extraordinarily energetic state, in an acute state. I think I mentioned in a different context, he says the mind has to be as sharp as a needle and as strong as a diamond. The reason for this is the fact that unless you have that astute mind, that sharp acumen, and you should have a heart which is pliable, which is willing to open itself up, which is willing to flower, which is willing to blossom, which is willing to become vulnerable. The mind is a symbolic representation of our reasoning. Heart is a symbol of feeling and unification. Both are required. Both are required in this adventure. And not an ordinary mind and an ordinary heart. They have to be extraordinarily astute in the case of the mind and extraordinarily pliable in the case of the heart. Then only it will be able to follow what is, because this what is not a thing. It is not something out there. And this what is dynamic, is tremendously vibrating, it's moving, it's living. So when it is moving and living, and this is constantly happening, there's not a single moment where the what is constant or just like that. It is moving, it is undergoing transformation. So unless you have this astute mind and pliable heart, you cannot see the what is. The what is becomes terribly important, because even if you just wink your eye, you may lose some of it. You may lose the continuity of it. You may lose the beauty in that movement, in that transformation. So that is what is required. But generally our mind is tethered to belief, to knowledge. And when it is tied up to a certain belief system, tied up to a certain knowledge which has been acquired, and tied up to the whole process with which it is very familiar, then what happens is it ceases to pursue. The mind is tied up now. If something is moving at a terrible speed, at a tremendous speed, unless you are also able to move with the same speed, you will not understand it. You will not come to it. You will not be able to keep up with it. So what is happening is a mind that is tied up, that is tethered to a belief system, to a basis of its own knowledge, which it has acquired over a long period of time. Then the pursuit is not there, because it is incapable of following the swift movement of what is. It is incapable, because you have lost it. You can't catch up with it. In order to catch up with it, you have to be in that state which he calls as extraordinarily astute mind and an extraordinarily pliable heart. This is the reason why we have to understand that we find it so difficult. The difficulty is not in the situation per se, or what he is talking about, but the difficulty is that we have entangled ourselves in such a manner, we have tied ourselves in such a manner that the untangling, the removing the ties which we have formed, the bondages which we have formed over a lifetime, the removal of that becomes difficult. Once that is removed, the rest of it is actually very easy. The rest of it, the actual process is very easy. So the mind can become astute and the heart can become pliable only when it is not tied up to something. Do we see the issue now? The issue is not the ability to see what is. The loss of that ability is on account of our tying up ourselves completely into knots. And the mind also creates a fear, saying that if I loosen these holds, if I untie myself, and if I drop this knowledge, then I'll be totally isolated, totally alone, and I can't stand on my own. I need support, I need crutches, I need somebody to hold on, something to hold on. If I give up all that, I'll become totally independent and totally isolated, which the mind is afraid of. The mind cannot imagine that, because the mind is always in the process of grasping and holding and catching and grabbing things and living with that. So that becomes the issue here. Unless you are able to have that state of mind which is free of beliefs, which is free of knowledge, which is free of everything it has preconceived and stored it as memory. Unless that happens, one will not be able to catch up with that swift movement of what is. That is the reason why what is becomes very difficult. So that is the reason why the what is always elusive. It eludes us. It simply, it is like something, water. If you're trying to put your hand into water and grab something, nothing comes into your hand. Your hand may become wet, but you can't actually, it is so fluid, it is so dynamic, and it is so swift that the mind can't keep up with it because it is tied up. This is the problem. This is the issue. This has to be clearly understood, and we need to contemplate it at a deeper level. Let us hold on to this. Let this be a living thing in our mind throughout. Let it be a living thing. Otherwise, the moment you form an opinion, form a conception of it, form an idea about it, it's only a dead matter which is now stored in the memory. Now we come to a very interesting statement. I'll read this statement and then we will try to analyze it, to try to understand it. There is extraordinarily acute suffering, and it is not individual only but collective. So it is a world catastrophe, and to limit it merely to a geographical area, a colored section of the map, is absurd, because then we shall not understand the full significance of this worldwide as well as individual suffering. So please find out what your response is to this cause, to this suffering. We'll come to that second sentence later, but are you able to see this? Can we just think of it and relate it to the present position in which we are? There is a acute suffering, and this suffering is not individual, is no longer personal, it is collective. Each one is suffering at his own level to the extent the situations created around him are providing that. And he says it is a world catastrophe, and you cannot limit it to a particular geographical area on the map, because that would be absurd. Because then we shall not understand the full significance of this worldwide as well as individual suffering. Now pick up this, and if you write it anywhere and put this up as a message in the WhatsApp, everybody will be able to correlate this with the coronavirus. Isn't it? We'll all be able to relate this statement to coronavirus and say that there is extraordinarily acute suffering. Look at the suffering of the migrants. Look at the suffering of the poor. Look at the suffering, psychological suffering of the rich. Look at the mental problems people are coming up with, though they have everything. And it is a world catastrophe. You can't limit it to a particular geographical area. We are unable to grasp the full significance of this worldwide as well as individual suffering. You know, the beauty of this is, this was the statement he made in 1954, which is, on the face of it, appears to be a statement made a few days ago or even yesterday in relation to the coronavirus. See, this is the depth at which somebody like JK is able to perceive global suffering, suffering of the entire mankind. For all of us, something like this coronavirus had to come about in order to become very partially aware of this acute suffering and the global suffering and the global dimension of the problem. I would say that we are not fully aware also. We are only partially aware to the extent I am inconvenienced. In certain cases, most of us are inconvenienced to the extent of not being able to go out as we used to do earlier. For some, the suffering is much more because they are losing their daily earnings and they don't have money to even eat proper food. For some, they have no place to live. They have no food. They have no water. They have no transportation. Suffering is something which is real. Suffering cannot be imaginary. Human suffering is something which is real. So you see the dimension of it. So somebody like JK has been able to perceive the direction in which the humanity is moving, where it is creating global catastrophes, where we now recognize that suffering is no longer individual, but it is collective, as the humanity as a whole. I wanted to bring this dimension to your notice that this was a statement made in 1954. When none of the things which we know about as of today were there. It appears as though the life in 1954 was totally of a different dimension altogether, where we have, some of us may have been there, some of them might have been born just then, or grown up during that period. It is something totally different. It was a totally different world from what we are encountering today. But the element of suffering, the element of suffering being universal, suffering being pertaining to the whole of mankind. It doesn't matter where it started, how it started, and how it has spread about, and who is to be blamed and who is not to be blamed is not the game at all. The fact of suffering is something which is collective and belongs to the entire humanity, or it would, I would say, belong to the whole of the universe. This is the dimension which somebody is able to perceive when things were okay. When things were not as complicated and as problematic as we are facing today. But what he has explained fits in so very well with our present day situation. Now he is putting a very interesting question again. He's saying, so please find out what your response is to this cause, to this suffering. One needs to examine this very carefully. One needs to go into it very carefully. Unless we are able to move in that direction. He has made another very interesting statement, which I have not put in the PowerPoint, but I would like to read out and tell you. Your response is one of indifference if you benefit by suffering, by the chaos. If you derive profit from it, either economic, social, political, or psychological. Therefore, you do not mind if this chaos continues. Surely, the more trouble there is in the world, the more chaos, the more one seeks security. You see, some people are there out making profit. Some people are making huge business out of this. A bottle of sanitizer which used to cost 50 rupees is being sold for 300 rupees. A mask which earlier used to cost about 5 rupees, they are selling it for 50 rupees. Look at the dimension which he is talking about. So your response is one of indifference. If you benefit by the suffering, by the chaos, the profit need not necessarily be economic only. The profit you are deriving could be social, could be political, could be religious, could be psychological. It could be in any form. That's what you are looking at. That is the kind of thing which you are indulging in. You are not concerned. Your response is one of indifference. So the more you seek all these things, the more the kind of problems and the more the kind of the situation, whether economic or social or political or religious or psychological, whatever you call it, will come up. So we have to understand at a deeper level as to what is or what should be our response. What should be our response? The moment you are aware of confusion of exactly what is, you try to escape from it. This is what the mind usually does. This is what the mind is usually capable of doing. The mind is simply trying to escape. Why? As he said earlier, the system becomes important. The economic system, the political system, the religious system becomes important to me because that is the way in which direction in which I can escape. I can blame the political system, I can blame the economic system, I can blame the religious system, I can blame the medical system, I can blame any system because my whole idea is to escape and I want a scapegoat. If you open the newspaper, this is what you find. Each one is still holding on to his philosophy, his idea, his ideology, and his system, and his thinking process, his opinions, and they become important and not the man. And we are so narrow-minded and so short-sighted that for the sake of the idea of the ideology, you are willing to sacrifice all mankind. You see the cruelty of it? See the danger of it? Do you see this danger? Are we not doing this on a day-to-day basis, that we are willing to sacrifice mankind? Because they have been, it is only a number game. The moment you open the WhatsApp messages or newspaper or look into any of the social media, it will tell you how many new virus cases have come up, how many things have come up. So it becomes a matter of statistics. It becomes a matter of only numbers. And then you also compare. We are better than that country. We are better than this country. Or that country is moving ahead into the danger zone and this country is moving into something else. So it has become a matter of statistics. But can we see the trauma? Now, if something happens in your own family to somebody who is close to you, who is near and dear to you, will it become a matter of statistics then? Will it become a matter of only a number in the newspaper? Then it becomes a reality. But we are cut off from this reality because we are holding on to ideas and ideologies and systems rather than seeing what is. Seeing what is requires a tremendous amount of energy, a great amount of sensitivity. Unless one is sensitive to the whole process, unless one is deeply concerned with it, one is bound to be in a situation where he would like to sacrifice the whole of mankind just for the sake of holding on to his system, his belief, his religion, his ideology. And see the beauty of it, as I said, every time we need to remind ourselves that this gentleman is talking about something about 64 years back. He's talking about something which has happened 66 years back, actually. He's talking in that milieu. And the next statement becomes much more serious, much more important. He says, what happens when we have no other values except the value of the things of the senses, the value of the products of the mind, of the hand, or of the machine? The more the significance we give to the sensual value of things, the greater the confusion, is it not? And being in confusion, we try to escape from it. Can you see this again? Actually, if you see, way back in 1954, there were not so many products which were pandering our senses. Not so many machines or so many, so much of technology which could develop products which would continuously attract our senses. But he made this statement, which again is so prophetic. Way back just before his death in 1983 or 82, he made a statement saying that the computers are going to take over mankind. By that time, even Bill Gates did not have any idea about how the computer is going to evolve. That was the time when Krishnaji said that you can wait and see that a day will come when machines, computers will take over humans. They will perform most of the activities which a man can perform today. And today there is such a rapid development of what is called as artificial intelligence and machine learning and other areas of cybernetics. Now, most of the jobs which are there today were not there 10 years back. And most of the people who have acquired certain skills today, they will become obsolete in the next 10 years. So we have so much of time on our hand now. That is only going to increase our stress. That is only going to create more and more problems, psychological problems. It's not going to resolve any of our problems. So this is the dimension which he is talking about. This is the dimension where one has to understand what exactly is happening. So I was really struck by some of his statements. I had to go back and verify in which year he actually delivered this talk. And this was compiled in a book in 1954. Okay. So this is the thing he is talking about. The first and last freedom is Introduction to the First and Last Freedom. Copyright is 1954 by the Krishnamurti Foundation of America. Look at the eternal values, eternal aspects he is talking about at a deeper level, which have significance across generations, across decades, and across centuries, and across millennia. So the more the pandering to our senses, the more will be the confusion, and the more we would try to escape from it because we are unable to confront the what is. And therefore he goes on to say, truth is in what is. And that is the beauty of it. We have to be still, observant, passively aware. There has to be a silence, not physical silence, an inner silence, a silence of the mind, a very observant mind, a mind which is acutely aware but passively. Passively in the sense not interfering with the whole process, not bringing in your own ideas into that process, into that awareness. So once we are in that state of silence, in that observant and passively aware state of being, then we'll be able to directly perceive the truth which is in what is. That is the significance of what is. And as he had mentioned earlier, the first step is the last step. The beginning and ending are one and the same. The first and last freedom are in it. You have to enter into it, enter into that state, come into that state through freedom, through that freedom, and therefore then only you will be able to come to it, come to the what is, which requires that inner silence and inner observation and awareness which he is talking about. Whatever we do at present seems to lead to chaos, seems to lead to sorrow and unhappiness. Look at your own life and you will see that our living is always on the border of sorrow. When somebody is operating within the framework of his own mental consciousness or mental dimension, which is, of course, we have seen that it is totally partial, limited, and fragmented. Anything that is done from that state of mind will only lead to chaos and confusion. Wherever you begin in that mental framework, in that dimension, it will only lead to sorrow and unhappiness. And he is saying, please look at your own life. We're always on the border of sorrow. And the border of sorrow in the sense that we don't know what we are going to encounter the next moment and what is it going to bring to me. Because I am tied up to my sensual pleasure, I am tied up to the known, I am tied up to what is comfortable to me. I have created a world which I think is going to sustain forever, and then it is going to be there always. But inside us, somewhere inside, we know that it is not going to be the truth. It is not the truth, and things are going to change. And we don't know in what direction that change will happen. So we are always on the verge of suffering and sorrow. In that context, he is putting this question now. He says, can we stop this misery at once and not go on always being caught by the wave of confusion and sorrow? So our problem, yours and mine, is whether we can step out of this misery instantaneously. Now, it is not a question of collectively descending or collectively getting into it or anything like that. The movement of this whole process is inward. So the transformation has to come within me. The transformation has to come through an inward process. And this transformation cannot take time or should not take time, because the dimension of time is what the mind is used to, and the mind happens to be the biggest obstacle. So when he says instantaneously, it is not about happening in the moment or on the linear scale of time, but in a totally different dimension, where you are able to perceive the whole thing at one stroke. wholly, totally, completely, unambiguously, once for all, you're able to see the whole thing in one dimension. When you are able to see that, then what happens? Then you are able to come to it. For you, the misery does not exist anymore. And he makes a statement that if you see that dimension, you create a world around you in which there is no sorrow. You create an environment around you, wherever you are, where this shadow of sorrow, living on the edge of suffering, will not be there. And that is where he says there is a possibility of communicating that. And that's the next sentence. And he goes on to say that if living in the world we refuse to be part of it, you will help others out of this chaos. Not in the future, not tomorrow, but now. Once when somebody sees this, the truth of it, once he sees the truth of it, he will refuse to be a part of it. No action on his part, whether it is thought, word, or deed, is going to perpetuate or prolong or enhance this suffering. You refuse to be a part of it because you have seen the truth of it. So there will be an order in your action. Everything you do is only going to help people to come out of this chaos and not create more chaos. And this, he says, not in the future, not tomorrow, but now. Actually, a person in that state is a great source of radiation of peace and happiness and joy, which can be felt by everybody around, which can be really felt by everybody around. That kind of living in this world is required. You can't say that I'll go away from this world. No, you are a part of this world and we continue to live in this world. But we refuse to be a part of that confusion, that chaos, that sorrow and suffering. Then you will help others out of this chaos. I don't know whether how far we can always think about it, whether this is true in its own dimension. But obviously it has got to be true because human evolution is moving progressively towards a higher level of consciousness. Unless somebody like J. Krishnamurti comes in and makes us aware of this, that you are capable of helping yourself and helping everybody else by stepping out of this nonsense, stepping out of this chaos and confusion, and you refuse to be a part of it. We must perceive them, confusion and misery. When he says them, he refers to confusion and misery and says we must perceive them. And then we shall be in a position to awaken the same understanding of truth in another. Now here comes all of us being together at the same level, at the same time, with the same intensity, which I mentioned right at the beginning of this discussion, where he talks about two friends meeting at the same level, at the same time, with the same intensity. When that happens, we shall be in a position to awaken the same understanding of truth in another, and perception can take place only in the present. It can take place now. You can't postpone it. The moment you postpone it, the seriousness is lost. The impact is lost. You have only simply converted into an idea or an ideology. It is no longer a living truth. In order to be a living truth, that perception has to take place in the present, in this moment, and then only it is possible. Now, is it possible to come to that state when you yourself perceive the truth instantaneously and therefore put an end to confusion? And Krishnamurti very categorically says, I say that it is, and that is the only possible way. He is not talking about a theory. He is not talking about somebody's experience or somebody's ideas. He says it is possible, that it is there, that you can perceive this truth instantaneously. And he says that is the only possible way. There is no other way. Therefore, true revolution can take place only when you, the individual, become aware in your relationship to another. A true revolution has to start with the individual, and one should become aware of this truth in our relationship to another. It doesn't mean person. It means to everything around us. In our relationship to everything around us, that should become the basis for our revolution. Society by itself is non-existent. Society is what you and I in our relationship have created. It is the outward projection of all our inward psychological states. It is that. So until I in my relationship to you understand myself, I am the cause of chaos, misery, destruction, fear, brutality. So blaming the society or thinking that the society is somewhere outside there. See, after all, you, me, a couple of friends and family members and relations and associates and business partners, we all together make the society. It is not something that has just come out of somewhere and fallen into our laps. Society by itself is what we have created through our relationship. And until that relationship is understood properly, it will be a source of chaos, misery, destruction, fear, and brutality. Understanding myself is not a matter of time. I can understand myself at this very moment. You see, if you allow that illumination to come into our life, if we allow that to happen, then we will be able to perceive a glimpse of it, and that glimpse will give you the direction in which one needs to move. It will give you the direction in which one needs to move from there. Now what happens is, we are so much disconnected with life as we live that it becomes almost impossible to perceive what Krishnaji is talking about. It becomes almost impossible for us, because he is talking about something very, very fundamental. And this can be made out from the statements which I have read earlier, which appear to be so contemporary, which so relevant for today, though they were made something 66 years ago. So that is the relevance of it. That unless we are able to perceive that, unless we are able to see that, we will not be able to understand the depth at which he is talking. It will only become another theory. Okay, oh sir, right sir, Krishnamurti he has explained so many things very well, sir. That's a foolish way of responding to it. There's a very foolish way of responding to it, because I have lost that seriousness. I'm not serious about it. I'm not serious about the transformation, and I'm not serious about that happening now. I'm only postponing it. Understanding is now, not tomorrow. Tomorrow is for the lazy mind, the sluggish mind, the mind that is not interested. If you do not change now, you will never change, because the change that takes place tomorrow is merely a modification. It is not transformation. Transformation can only take place immediately. The revolution is now, not tomorrow. When that happens, you are completely without a problem, for then the self is not worried about itself. Then you are beyond the wave of destruction. I think I've gone on for more than 1 hour, 15 minutes. So some chat is there. Veena Mirchandani. What is the intelligence in the moment? Is that right? That is why it is eternal? Yes, madam, it's very much so. It is that intelligence is something you can give any different name also. See, there are different names to it. Krishnaji wanted to use the term intelligence. It's not the normal term generally we use as intelligence quotient or anything like that. This intelligence is that light of that enlightenment, that illumination from which you see everything in the right perspective, in a holistic manner. So I am deriving a psychological benefit from this pandemic. Happy to read and imbibe knowledge, and the reason is that we are forced to be home. I am happy. But is this irresponsible? No. See, as you said, we are all deriving a benefit from this pandemic because we are at home and we are able to have these webinars and more people are able to participate. That's a kind of benefit you are deriving, but it's not to be seen as a benefit per se. When you think in terms of benefit and profit, it is the mind which is coming into the picture. It is the mind which is trying to say that, oh, I have drawn some advantage out of this or taken away. The true benefit would be that creation of seriousness in oneself. The urgency of that change that is required, the urgency of that transformation. The impact which this has on me, that is more relevant. But if you think only in terms of a psychological benefit, then I would rather agree with you and say it is definitely irresponsible. Is JK suggesting that we need to transcend joy and sorrow by inner silence and passive awareness? Is this the state of sthita prajnatva? Now, one point I would like to draw your attention is, how do you define joy and sorrow? If you are purely understanding them or defining them as experiences of our daily life through the senses and the mind, then it is something which has to be kept aside. Not exactly transcending, but you have to drop it. This mental experiences, whether of joy or sorrow or any kind, which are based on the sensual inputs and the inputs we take from our own mental dimension, all those things have to be kept aside. Only once when you keep them aside, you are in a state of acute awareness of what is, and the chattering of the mind is no longer there. That creates the silence. You're not creating, removing the chattering mind. You are keeping aside the chattering mind. Therefore, there is an inner silence which happens on its own, uninvited, and there is an awareness in which the mind is no longer active. That is the meaning of passive awareness. The mind is no longer active, but you are acutely aware, and there is a silence in that. And that state of silence, in that, this intelligence operates. We have another forum in which we discuss about Jiddu Krishnamurti and his, teachings in Telugu, in the vernacular language, in the local language here. So one of the words that had to be translated is this intelligence. This intelligence, we are calling it as prajna. Prajna is a very traditional term, because that is what you find in the Vedic literature. Thousands of years ago, they have used this term, and one of the Mahavakyas is Prajnanam Brahma. That ultimate reality, which is symbolized by the word Brahman, is Prajna. Jna means to be aware of. Pra, the prefix, means tremendously aware of. in an excellent way, in a supreme way, being aware of it. So therefore, this intelligence can be rightly translated as prajna. Because you have to, when you are looking at the Indian traditional way of looking at things, you have to distinguish between knowledge, wisdom, and ultimate reality. This knowledge, wisdom, and the intelligence which Krishnamurti is talking are totally three different things. This knowledge is acquired from the surroundings, acquired through your senses and your mind and the whole manifestation, whole creation. So that is why we call it, if you are interested in the traditional term, we will call it as parijnana. Wisdom is jnana, but intelligence is prajna. So if you are trying to correlate with what Krishna, Lord Sri Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita as Sthita Prajna, that's a state of being when you are not disturbed by any dualities. Dvandvatita, that is something you are not disturbed by the dualities at all. When you are not disturbed by the dualities, it obviously means that your mind is not active, because mind can only look at things in duality. Wherever there is a term, it tries to create an opposite of it or a duality of it, and it's able to only play with these dualities and multiplicities. So the lack of that state of multiplicity is Sthita Prajnatva. In a way, you are right, but these terms should only be helpful to us for a deeper understanding of Krishnaji, but not simply for academic comparison of what Krishnaji is saying or what Bhagavad Gita is saying. That danger we have to avoid that, and not fall into that trap of doing academic exercises. That's my request. Then Mohit Dwivedi says, is it possible to observe each and every act of mind that it plays in front of us? And if it is possible, then what should be our responses to it? Shall we accept it, reject it, or do nothing and just observe? Now, again, this is a question which the mind is putting to itself. You see the trap? Do you see the trap in this whole problem? Who is putting this question? One part of Mohit Dwivedi is putting to another part of Mohit Dwivedi. This is the trap the mind always leads us to. One part of the mind imagines that there is something called as liberation, something called as moksha, something called as intelligence, something called as Brahman, you give. And the other part says, this part says to the other part that I should attain that. Now, this is the whole thing. See, observation in a different context, I think I have mentioned that when you are observing your thoughts, generally two things we do. We add energy to that thought of our own. We add our own energy to that thought, and we also unconsciously give a direction to that thought. That is why one thought after the other comes, because we are giving energy and also making it to move in a direction in which we like. Now, the first thing that needs to be done is, can we observe how thoughts emerge without doing anything about it? Without doing anything about it. Don't add any energy whatsoever. Don't give it any direction whatsoever. The moment you give energy and direction, you are only creating what is called as a closed loop. Creating a closed loop, it is perpetuating, it is repeating itself, and it goes on and on and on and on, unending. In order to break this, the only possible way is to not add energy and direction to the thought that arises. In one context, Krishnaji says, thought has its own energy, independent of the I, independent of me. If a particular thought is coming out of in my mind, It is on account of the experiences, knowledge, and stored memory, and all that, that whole bundle of it is there. Out of that, a particular thought is coming. The source is me, but when it comes up, it is independent of me to the extent as to I don't know how it is coming, why it is coming, and things like that. So when that thought comes, then don't add energy to it. The first thing it is said when you start observing your own thoughts is that the frequency of thoughts will come down. The frequency, the number of thoughts will come down. Then your awareness becomes more and more sharp. If there are too many thoughts, you lose awareness, you will lose attention. But if you are able to bring about some awareness and attention to the whole process, then the frequency and the number of thoughts will come down. And you are able to observe how the thoughts are emerging. And if you are not adding energy to it and direction to it, the thought will exhaust itself and drop down. The thoughts will exhaust itself and they will be dropped. So that is what is required. So no other response is required. Let us observe our own thoughts without adding energy and giving direction to it. That is the most important thing that needs to be done. Then what happens? You are not actually responding to it. No, response means you are not talking about rejecting or accepting or doing anything. You are simply observing it. And then see what happens. It's not for me or somebody else or even Krishnamurti or somebody else to tell us what happens. He may talk about his experience, I may talk about my experience, which will be totally irrelevant to you. So the whole process is to initiate, to begin to be acutely aware, then see what happens. Then that perception itself will bring a great amount of transformation. That perception itself is of a totally different dimension altogether. Okay, can you just give me 1 second? Because I think my system is, power has become low. Just give me 1 moment. Yes, I have connected the power. Now coming to Idris Ahmed, making the mind sharp and strong as diamond. Is this not another excuse of the mind? Is a pure heart not enough to understand the absolute? Now, you are calling one as an excuse and creating another excuse. You are absolutely right, Idris, when you say that make the mind sharp and strong is an excuse, provided you are not serious. It will not be an, see, it is like, let us imagine one thing. There is a huge stone, which is say 100 kilos. And I want to move it. The question is, do I really want to move it? If I really want to move it, I will make the right kind of effort to move it. Then it's not an excuse. You are bringing the necessary strength to move it. Either through your own muscle power or some machine power or some lever or something else. You are bringing some tools and things like that to move it. Now, if your intention is to very seriously move that stone, you will bring that sharpness and that strength into it. But if your intention, your attitude is not one of seriousness, then it becomes an excuse. You have to be very careful about these things. Just don't blindly follow what Krishnamurti is saying or me. I am a fool like me is talking about it. Doesn't make any difference. The only thing is, how are you looking at it? And what is a pure heart? Pure heart is also an excuse. What do you mean by pure heart? Is it like pure ghee, pure butter? What does this term pure mean? The heart should be willing to open itself up to anything and everything, willing to receive whatever is there. But the mind prevents it from doing it. Mind only wants pleasant experiences, happy experiences, happy memories, happy knowledge, running after pleasures which the senses give me. At the same time, the mind is not unwilling to receive pain, unwilling to confront and take pain. But a pliable heart, or as you call it as a pure heart, is something which is willing to open itself up to anything that is there. See, what is more in this world? Is suffering more or happiness more? The fact of the matter is suffering is more. It's a fact. It's not something to be debated. Even those fellows who think that they are happy are actually suffering with their happiness. So you see the problem? So to confront the fact, you need tremendous amount of energy. He's talking about that. When he says about an astute mind and a pliable heart, he's talking about both the dimensions. Are we in a position to acutely feel the suffering of the whole humanity? Am I in a position to bring all my energies to give action, to give direction in a way that I can step out of this suffering? That is the thing that is being brought. There is nothing like enough. The pure heart is enough. It's not about heart or mind. See, these are all symbols. The mind stands for one symbol, the heart stands for another symbol. What he is trying to say is bring the totality of all your being, your mind, your heart, your total self into the whole picture, and then act with that seriousness. Now, there's somebody from the school of ancient wisdom says, it is one of the most difficult things to do. Krishnaji used to say one should begin to play with one's awareness, and that will eventually lead to the absolute. Now, see, we are always, a very interesting statement is made by Krishnamurti when he says, majority of the human beings like to be spectators and not participants. Participation is a difficult thing, isn't it? Look at, unfortunately, we have lost the IPL season and all that. But look at it. If the IPL season were to be there, how many would be playing? About 10 teams, 20 teams of 20 each, 400. You include the umpires and commentators and everybody. Will it exceed 1,000? No. But look at how many millions and millions and millions of people would be watching as spectators. In respect to finding out this truth, realizing this ultimate reality, also, most of us would like to be spectators rather than participants. We would like to hear more and more about spirituality, more and more, read more and more about it, have more and more webinars and seminars and meetings and programs and sessions and whatnot. Because we don't want to get into the game. We don't want to actually play. Playing is a difficult thing. No? Playing requires skill. Playing requires tremendous amount of discipline. Playing requires tremendous amount of practice. Isn't it? If you see the sports pages in the newspapers now, you see all these great sportsmen are also confined to their home, but they are continuously keeping themselves fit. Like, why is it that military personnel are made to drill every day? Because they have to keep themselves fit. A war can come anytime. You can't say that let the war come, then I will prepare myself. You can't do that. So this fitness, this play, or beginning to participate in that directly, Instead of being a spectator, to be a participant in the whole thing, you have to begin it somewhere. And that is, as you rightly said, is a difficult thing. It's not so easy. We have 100 other things to do which are easy. Normally, what do we do? Normally, even if you're talking about any office work or any other work or anything, suppose we have 10 tasks to do, we will first finish off with the easier ones and keep on postponing the difficult ones. Because you see, by focusing on the difficult ones, we can't do the easy ones. So there is a logic behind doing those things in an office environment. But in life, that's not the case. Because you can spend your whole time only doing the easier things and leaving the difficult things for the end. So this is what happens. So you have to get into it. You have to begin to play with one's awareness. That means you have to start it. Be serious about it. Be a participant and not a spectator. Eventually means, see, unless you begin, nothing can happen. You can't sit on the shore just wetting your feet and never getting into the ocean. That won't help anybody. So if you are serious about it, you will plunge into it. And you are not bothered about the time factor then. You're not bothered about whether eventually one will come to the absolute or not, becomes irrelevant. Because the beginning is more important and the seriousness you bring to the whole thing is more important. There are no more questions. So I think we have exceeded the given time also. Any more questions, please?
Anybody?
Yeah. Thank you, Ramesh ji.
I think, yeah.
Yes, I think we have had enough of it.
No, we haven't had enough of it, but today has come to an end. So thank you all. Thank you so much, Krishnapani ji, for taking time out and doing this for us on a weekly basis. We're really enjoying this journey of total freedom that we're getting with, with you interpreting J. Krishnamurti, because he's actually very difficult to follow otherwise. So thank you so much for simplifying it for us. And next week again, we will meet, and the topic will be, we'll meet on Saturday, 23rd. The topic is going to be ambition. That's the next chapter.
Yes.
For those who would like the PowerPoint presentation on total freedom, if you are not part of our Bhagavad Gita group, then maybe you can just post your email address on any of the School of Ancient Wisdom WhatsApp chats, and I will make sure that you are added to that list, and we will regularly update you with the latest PowerPoint presentation, which will be updated for that particular session. Okay, so just make a note of that and please do that. This Thursday, on the 21st of May, we have our Thursday satsang as usual, Spiral of Wisdom. And we have a great speaker, Dr. Thimappa Hegde, talking to us on the greatness of the Bhagavad Gita. So this starts again at 7 o'clock on Thursday. And then we have the next webinar on Saturday, 23rd with Krishnapani ji at 11:30. So thank you all so much for being here, and we'll close the program with Loka Samasta. Sajini, are you there?
Yeah.
Sajini?
I think she is there.
Sajini?
She's there. I don't know, she has to unmute herself to be heard.
Sajini? I don't know if she's...
Somebody else can do it.
Yeah. Can we have Meena, will you do it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Gurubhyo Namaha. Harihi Om. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meena. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Thank you so much once again, Krishna Paniji. Thank you.
madam.
So Krishna Paniji, we are going to plunge into it.
Oh, yeah, sure. Please do. Thank you.
Om Namah Shivaya.